Ladies and gentlemen, the presentation is starting. Paul, please go ahead.
Thank you, George, and welcome everybody to Creating IT SLAs, How to Remove the Complexity and Get Started. It's a webcast presented by Uptime Software. My name is Paul Gillen, and I'll be your host and moderator. And in a moment, we'll hear from Alex Bewley, CTO of Uptime Software. But first, a little housekeeping. During the webcast, our speaker slides will be pushed to your screen automatically. If you want to view the presentation full screen, look for the small green Maximize button on the top right of your window. You can also drag the corner of the presentation window to reduce or enlarge its size. You'll also see some widgets along the bottom of the console. Click on the green Download Slides widget to access the presentation in PDF format. Also, the Resources widget will give you other valuable content from Uptime Software. After Alex finishes his prepared remarks, he'll field your questions. You can submit a question by typing it into the text box on your webcast console and clicking the Submit button. He'll either answer your question in the Q&A portion at the end or personally in an email to follow. Also, we'll be live tweeting during the event. You can comment on @UptimeSoftware or use the event hashtag, which is #SLAReporting. Finally, we'll be asking you 2 poll questions during your webcast, and we very much appreciate getting your answers to them as they help our speaker to better refine his comments and also to help you see more about the other attendees in the webcast. So now let's move on to today's topic. Service-level agreements are the standard by which IT performance is measured, but creating useful and actionable SLAs has become more complicated in a world of cloud computing, virtualization, and heterogeneous platforms. Writing SLAs for this increasingly complex environment means reviewing metrics and focusing on the ones that really matter to the business. It also means understanding how the application is constructed, how people interact with it, and how elements of the infrastructure work together. By taking a team approach and using unified monitoring, organizations can proactively track service levels and identify problems before they get out of hand. Then they can iterate what they've learned to constantly improve SLA metrics. It's not as complicated as it sounds, and in this webcast, Alex Bewley of Uptime Software will boil down the complexity of SLAs to a few key points that you need to know. Alex will show you how to build an IT SLA in only 15 minutes. That includes how to define a service by grouping infrastructure and applications, how to remove SLA risk by back testing, and how to identify trends and report on them so that you can see a problem before it develops. Alex has had a 17-year career bridging technology and business. He co-founded Uptime Software in 2001, and today Uptime is a premier provider of systems management software for virtual and physical server monitoring, capacity planning, and service and application monitoring with more than 850 clients in 32 countries. Alex also continues to be active in the tech startup community, in addition to maintaining his interest in flying, travel, and triathlons. Alex, ready to start your triathlon?
All right. Thanks so much, Paul. And so as Paul mentioned, I am CTO of Uptime Software, and I have been doing this for quite a long time. And certainly, I've traveled the world meeting customers in all kinds of industries and of all different sizes, from hundreds of servers to tens of thousands. And I've seen some pretty crazy things, but one thing continues to amaze me, and that's given all this wonderful technology like the internet and virtualization, cloud computing, VDI, virtualized storage, and all sorts of really cool technologies, is we still continue to have the same problems in systems management that we had 30 years ago. Where is stuff running? How is it doing? When's it going to break? And how can we stop that from happening again? Or, how can I stop being yelled at? So with the advent of all these technologies, the problem is getting worse, not better. So how do we go about dealing with this? And that brings us to our presentation today. So we're talking about service level agreements, or SLAs, and how they manifest themselves in an IT world. So some of the things I want to cover off today are talking about some terminology, right, and some higher level discussion around what kinds of SLAs there are. I'm going to talk about BSM, or Business Service Management, and what it means for people in IT. I'm going to talk about deconstructing an application for SLA reporting and monitoring, creating routines around SLAs, building up credibility around SLAs. How do we pull this all together? And frequently what I've found is that we can say something and different people understand it in different ways. For example, if I say capacity planning, what do you think of, right? Do you think of complex mathematical models that simulate load and throughput throughout a system or a series of systems? Or do you simply think of a chart with a trend line indicating that you're going to run out of disk space in 36 days? And I use this example because we hear it all the time. Capacity planning is not always capacity planning. The same thing occurs with SLAs. What exactly do we mean? So let's take a step back here. So I'm going to use this quote from business guru Peter Drucker. What gets measured gets managed. And I completely agree with this. However, we can measure and manage all the wrong things, especially in a very complex IT environment. And this is compounded by the very nature of us being IT people. We see the world through rose-tinted glasses. So how do we actually deal with this? Well, we come to webinars like this and see the world a different way. And we get some insight into what kinds of things we should be measuring and managing. So flipping to SLAs, or service level agreements, again, I mentioned there are many different ways that, or they have many different kinds of meanings. And like I said about capacity planning, there are many different definitions. So here we have what we consider three major kinds of service level agreements: contractual, service desk-based, and infrastructure-based. So contractual SLAs, I would think of these as being higher level, and there's a few categories of these. Something like being outsourced, right? Like an IBM Global Services or Wipro or some kind of managed service provider. It could be an application or infrastructure provider like a Salesforce.com or Amazon Web Services. It could be a small application service like Evernote or Dropbox or any number of web-based services that exist nowadays. In these cases, you're generally negotiating terms of service and expectations, and it's a very involved process, especially for outsourcing. And this is the kind of SLA that tends to pop into most people's heads when they're thinking about planning. You just get overwhelmed with all this crazy contractual speak and legalese, and most people tend to get scared off by this kind of thing. The second kind of SLA is service desk-based, and these tend to be more ticket-based, and the reporting is done on a ticket or summary of tickets. So examples of this would be, you're activating a cell phone when you walk into a store, right? Or sample workflows, you're deploying a system in-house, right? And this would include items like you're purchasing it, then you're configuring it, then you're installing applications, and then you're doing security testing, and then putting it into production, right? Or you're bringing new staff on board, right? You're creating their accounts, and you're setting security policies, and you're assigning them a phone or a login, something along that vein. And then there are infrastructure-based SLAs, and this is probably what most of you are very familiar with, as it tends to involve outages and outage reporting of IT infrastructure. So you're signing up for ensuring that IT services are working in a reliable fashion. So the challenge for a lot of people coming from the infrastructure world, and really this is an evolution of capability, is understanding how to measure complex workflows and workflows that involve people and process. This is where service desk reporting comes into play. So using standard monitoring tools, how would you monitor something that takes a long time? For example, let's use a healthcare example of requesting an MRI or an X-ray. First off, the doctor requests the exam, the image gets taken, it gets analyzed, stored, and posted to a healthcare management system, and then it's retrieved by the doctor. There's infrastructure involved in every component, but the entire process can take a day or several days. The business metrics would be, how long is it taking to process the MRIs or X-rays, analyze them, and were there any exceptions? And how do you answer this question from an infrastructure point of view? Right? You can have application availability for each application involved, but there probably isn't a holistic metric. You can't really do this. So how do you go about asking the right questions, and why is asking these questions important? So we talk about BSM, right, or business service management, and what do we mean by that? I am sure you've heard this term referred to in many different ways. And BSM essentially is a business-centric view of your services provided to business users or customers, and sits above ITSM, or IT service management. So it's like an overarching umbrella. And really what we're trying to do is change how we look at applications and flip from a technological view to a consumer point of view. Unfortunately, the hardest part about this as infrastructure people is it involves people and process, and that becomes messy in a really big hurry, and it's not really what we want to deal with. Properly implementing BSM also involves understanding the business workflows and architecture of applications, and that can be very complicated. So what is it that we are trying to achieve? So bringing this back down, what's truly important, right? What we're trying to make sure of is that we, being IT and business, are talking the same language. For example, let's say you're a mobile cellular company and you bill for ringtones that people pick. The business metrics would be, when somebody requests a ringtone, are we billing them? Are they getting the right ringtone that they picked? And is it being provisioned within a fixed period of time? Right? From an infrastructure point of view, all the underlying systems may indicate the process is working. Right? The billing system might be functional, the server that hosts the ringtones might be working, and the network infrastructure might be fine. Are you actually able to capture if the user received what they paid for? Now, I use this example because I know of a company that was billing users for ringtones, but they weren't getting provisioned. Yet all the underlying monitoring indicated that everything was okay. This was a business logic error. So another example of, and this was a little bit more visceral for me, was sitting in on an uncomfortable meeting, and we were new to the account because we'd been brought in to help set up SLA reporting, and the meeting was interesting because it was between the CIO of a mobile phone company and its outsourcer, and it was a classic case of two people talking about totally different things. So the outsourcer was demonstrating a dashboard to the CIO and indicating that he could see all the outages from the various regions of his business. And the CIO then asked about a few of these outage messages that he saw on the dashboard, and they're file system capacity related. And the CIO asked, why is this important? I don't understand why this is important to me as the CIO. What revenue generating application is this impacting? Show me what it means. And this kept on going on and on. The outsourcer was talking about infrastructure bits and pieces, and the CIO wanted to know if his subscribers were being effective, if his billing was not working, or if customer care wasn't available. He wanted higher order views into the environment that affected dollars and cents, right? If you can't bill, you can't make money. So how do we get this kind of visibility, and is this kind of visibility possible? And it's hard. You really need to know a lot about your applications. Examples, I'm sure you've been through the case where you don't know if an application's down until users call in, right? It doesn't look very good, but it happens quite often, right? So how do you actually scratch the veneer and understand what's going on? And sometimes you aren't going to know everything, right? Because it's prepackaged applications or it's third-party hardware. You're just not going to know. So at the end of the day, why are we talking about BSM or business service management, right? It's to lend some understanding of, you might not be there. It is really hard to have higher level discussions with business. It might just be too complicated. Some applications or some services, some workflows are extremely complicated, right? So this is all very reasonable. It's okay not to understand. I'm just trying to set the stage for how you should be thinking about this within your environment. So deconstructing an application, right? So you've inventoried a collection of applications in your environment, right? And this can be very, very difficult because you could be supporting hundreds of applications, right? And they will be of varying degrees of business and revenue criticality. What I've generally seen is people do A, B, C in tiers, or level 1, 2, and 3 of mission criticality. It's also a very valuable task to go through if you haven't already done so already. So you want to identify what are key business metrics, right? And so these are things like dollars per hour, or transactions per minute, or number of claims per day. You want to identify risk points, right? Is it really, really old code or really, really old systems? Are there architecture documents which outline how the app works? In a lot of cases, these don't exist, and you have to figure out how the application works yourself. You have to understand how the app is built, right? And I've seen applications that span over 50 pieces of infrastructure and go through 5 different underlying applications, all from different vendors. It gets really, really complicated. what infrastructure does the application actually sit on? What are key dependencies? Will an outage in one component take out many, many applications, right? Can you prioritize which components to work on if there are multiple failures? For example, if you have 2 database failures, would your DBAs know which is a revenue critical application versus something that is less important? And nowadays there are cloud dependencies. There are a lot of third-party services which are really interesting out there. And this one is really interesting because it's very subversive. And I had the opportunity to chat with a CIO of a Fortune 500 company, and he wanted to do a survey of all the external or cloud-based applications they were using within the company. And they'd only authorized 13 cloud-based providers. Again, this is for Fortune 500. So what they did was they monitored all their global internet access points for a month and then combed through the logs. And they found that over 250 different cloud-based providers were being used. Right? So at that point, they realized they had no control. Right? So the problem for a CIO is if internal applications get built using these external services, how can you possibly monitor and control and understand what's going on with your own key business applications if these dependencies are out there? So what we want to try and do now is go through certain kinds of SLA routines. How can we actually understand what's going on? What is a component of an SLA, right? So we want to claw our way out of the infrastructure-centric view of the world and try to present information in a way that helps us know when we are delivering the applications that we're supposed to, and that we get a heads up when things might not be going to plan, right? So we can build our SLAs in tiers, and we think of what are critical tasks for our applications, right? Can we actively monitor them, or is it a complicated workflow? Can we prioritize our applications? What are revenue or customer critical applications? How can you quickly communicate outage information as it relates to critical applications? Right? Again, this is if a key piece of infrastructure goes and impacts many, many applications. Can you report on application availability? Right? In some cases, you're going to have to do blended reporting, right? And that's a combination of active monitoring and analysis of your service desk data. I've seen this frequently done in Excel. Can you automate your reporting from the service desk? Can you combine service desk and infrastructure monitoring into performance and availability data warehouse so you can do some easy analysis? One other component is, can you backtest your SLA, right? And this is important because people tend to overestimate availability percentages. 5 nines availability is really, really expensive and very hard to deliver, especially at an application level. We also tend to forget about things like maintenance windows. If everybody in your call center goes home at 9 p.m., there's no reason for the application to be up. You can take it down and mangle it all you like. And something that's important to do is backtest your SLAs, right? Get an understanding of what you're signing up for. So if things are complicated, you kind of want to take it a step at a time. And certainly, one of the things you want to understand, with properly designed SLAs is life can be a lot easier. And certainly what it can identify is, outages that perhaps recur quite frequently, right? And how, if you see a recurring problem, something you might want to do is actually, rebuild it or re-architect it. And here's a simple example here is, we had a customer they kept hitting their file system capacity limits. I know this is a low-level example, and it was triggering alerts. So they created an automation that auto-grew their file systems. Now, this was subject to some business rules, obviously, but they were able to reduce their service desk load by 600 tickets a month, right? So while this is great use of automation and problem solving, are you actually solving the root cause issue, right? I mean, no, technically you're not. You're reducing load in your service desk, but something is still filling up your file system. Sorry, we have a poll here.
That's right, Alex. First poll question for our audience. What is your timeline to deploy SLAs? No plans, 6 to 12 months, or you're currently monitoring SLAs. While you're doing that, I want to remind you of the Resources tab, which is on your console. It includes a download of this presentation as well as a 30-day free trial. And you can open that tab and keep it open to quickly reference those resources while you're listening to the rest of our webcast. So with that in mind, why don't we have a look at the response from our audience to the question, what is your timeline to deploy SLAs? And it looks like currently monitoring, or 6 to 12 months. So it looks like about 80% of our audience will be on SLAs within the next 6 to 12 months. Does that surprise you at all, Alex?
No, I think that's wonderful, and certainly, as we do these webinars, or have done them over the years, it's really interesting to see how currently monitoring SLAs was a very low percentage and just keeps on increasing every time. So again, there's a very high awareness of that SLAs are a key component of your IT world.
And I just want to remind our audience also, if you have questions for Alex, please get them in as early as possible. That tab color, by the way, that should be a green resources tab, I believe, you're looking for. Alex, please continue.
All right, thanks. All right, so in terms of getting on the same page with the business, right? And I must admit, this is getting better and better every year that goes by. And historically, the relationship between business and IT has been somewhat combative, but that is obviously much less so. But certainly, I titled this slide "Getting Respect," and really, it's more a cautionary advice that you just don't want to jump into doing service level agreements without actually understanding what you're delivering as an organization right now. And that is really, you have to take care of the small stuff first, right? So if you go to the business and say, hey, I'm ready for BSM and I can provide you with a raft of SLAs, and yet you're constantly hounded with trivial kinds of outages, it's going to be hard for you to get the respect that you require to actually engage in a higher level conversation. And certainly, don't aim too high at the beginning. I mean, we all want to succeed and we all want to do it as quickly as possible, but you really got to, build up the reporting infrastructure, right? Understand what you're committing to. Can you at least get some insight into where you're even at from an availability point of view, right? And certainly, one of the things you want to strive for is make it iterative, right? So aim for week over week or month over month improvements, and demonstrate that you are improving, right? Whether that's through internal process controls, whether it's through different kinds of infrastructure, whether it's through changing the types of applications underneath. Again, you can demonstrate improvement over time, and really overcome the fear of transparency, right? And I must admit, this one is improving quite considerably, because we've found in the past people would say, you know what, we don't want to produce any public-facing dashboards to our business users because things are so bad we don't want them to see. Yes, it's bad to have outages, but communally working on these things better is much better, and certainly giving the business insight into, well, here's where things are going wrong. It opens up a conversation point. So if someone says to you, I need performance to be twice as quick, you can sit back and say, well, look, you know what? This is all the infrastructure that is required to deliver this service, right? These are how the applications are built. We're just not there, right? Let's pick a different way to have this discussion on performance and availability. So flipping a little bit here is, how do we actually pull all of this together, right? And what now that we've sort of conceptually reviewed some aspects of SLAs, how do we put these into practice? What kind of tooling do we need to get started down the path? Again, you need a solution that can integrate or unify information across your entire infrastructure. And at a high level, this would include what I would consider two key things. And this is availability information and then performance information. And you need to harmonize these from the bottom up, right? From elements in the infrastructure up to entire applications. So your solution essentially needs to be able to provide a dual role. So on one hand, it needs to report macro trends that drive SLA reporting, but it also needs to provide the real-time insight into what's causing issues or grief within the infrastructure that might be impacting SLAs right now. So for the second component here of the webinar, I'm actually going to go through, let's step through an SLA. What does that actually mean from a tool or solution point of view? And I'm going to pick email as a service, right? So I'm going to start from dashboards all the way down to the monitors, right? And I'm going to do a bit of deconstructing or decomposing of SLAs, right? So SLAs, they're made of SLOs, or service level objectives, and then service level objectives are made of applications and services, and then applications are made of monitors, and applications have master and regular services, right? So it's important to understand that you're building upon or you're making your SLA reporting out of many aggregations of components, right? So I'm going to step through this example here and give you an idea of what does an SLA actually look like, and what would we describe as availabilities. So here we have overview of our SLAs, and as part of this step through, I'm going to show you kind of a combination of screens and reports and demonstrate it. So here's a simple dashboard, right? And it shows a list of SLAs prioritized by status, right? And SLAs that are in violation are on top, and the ones trending to be out of compliance are listed or prioritized below. And you can also see some major sections of each SLA. So how far through the compliance period we are, how much of the allowed outage time has been consumed and how much is left, and what's your target availability. And the compliance period, it might be a new term to some people, what we find is it's generally a week or a month, and most commonly a month. So it's important to understand that dealing with outages from an operations point of view, where near to real-time notifications are super important, it isn't necessarily the same view that would be taken by a business owner who just wants to understand if the service in general is working as it should, and is availability improving over time. So let's drill into an SLA. So if your SLAs are not trending properly, or if you're trying to understand what might be going wrong, you can drill into an SLA and see what its components are. So in this example, which we've picked Microsoft Exchange, we've identified three major components. So Active Directory, Exchange performance, and Exchange availability. And this would include things like your MTAs and web services and mail sending and retrieval. So you want to kind of think of these as the major architectural components of Exchange, right? AD is used for user management and authentication. Performance is for identifying excessive delays in your retrieving or sending mail. And then we're also checking for, can we absolutely or can we send or retrieve email? So at this point, we're still not drilling down into how these components are monitored. We'll get to that in a little bit. We're just identifying critical sections of the service. And for each of these major components, we also have target availabilities, as shown on the right-hand side. We can also see how we're doing against the target. And these groups or categories or components what we would call service level objectives or SLOs. So from a reporting point of view, breaking the service into discrete components help you track categories of outages and possibly identify recurring outage themes. So those were two dashboards. So those were things that you'd pull up on your screen or put in a network operating center. So let's take a step back here and define an SLA. Now, this is a very dense screen. There are lots of things on it. But the SLA is composed of many different things, and ideally we want them to be more service-oriented or structured to how the end user would interact with the application. So not only is availability important, for example, I must be able to retrieve my email, we also want to take a performance view of the service. For example, it shouldn't take that long to retrieve my email. Additionally, one aspect of SLAs that most people don't really think about is when the application is used. So, for example, let's take a retail point-of-sale system. It's only used when the store is open. So even if you're a national chain of stores, your effective point-of-sale system hours may only be between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Outside of these hours, it just doesn't matter if the system's running, which means you can have large maintenance windows, and you don't need 24/7 SLAs. Over to you, Paul.
That's right. It's time for our next next poll, excuse me. How many applications would measure using SLAs? Would you measure using SLAs? 0 to 25, 26 to 50, 51 to 100, or more than 100? And a reminder again, the questions area is open, and we're looking forward to getting your questions. Get them in early so that Alex has a chance to get to them. Also, don't forget the Twitter hashtag for this event, #SLA reporting, if you have a comment on this presentation or anything that Alex is saying. With that in mind, let's have a look at the answers to the poll. And it looks like most of them 50 or less applications using SLAs, about nearly 80%. Alex?
Yep. No, that definitely makes sense. And again, it's interesting to see because the people who have the very large numbers of applications have extremely complex environments that they have to manage.
Okay. By the way, we do have questions coming in. If the questions are overly technical, in other words, something that Alex can't really address in the time we have available, we will get back to you offline to answer your questions, but you will get a response. So, Alex, you can pick it up from there.
All right. Thank you, Paul. So, just jumping back into talking about the various aspects of an SLA, I mentioned availability and performance. So what I've got here is just a snippet from a sample report of response time and availability. And so this report is actually over the course of a week. And the data you see here is collected by a series of monitors. And again, we still haven't got down into that component yet. But the monitors or the rules within the monitors, they define when the SLO is not actually, or the SLO within the SLA is not working properly. So, for example, if response time is above a certain threshold for a period of time, or if specific components of the service are not functioning correctly, right? So this report can be reviewed by an IT operations team on it can be done daily or weekly, and essentially it gives you an idea of where are our outages occurring, and in which components or categories of the SLA, and so what are our root causes of what's going on. And certainly, as you view these things over time, you can start to see where funny recurring behavior is happening, right? Is it something that's happening every night? Is it something that's happening once a week or once a month during big runs or big jobs? So you get some insight into what's going on in your environment as it pertains to the definition of a service or an application. So now let's actually flip into the detailed parts of an SLO. So again, this is a different dashboard view, and what it lists here is different kinds of applications, right? So here we have a collection of application monitors, and you can see a bunch of these are part of the email service. And the SLOs within an SLA use these applications or the application monitors to determine their statuses. And what's important to understand here is that application monitors are a blend of end-user performance and availability. There are also two key kinds of monitors, and you'll see in the columns of little colored bars on the right-hand side there. And we call them master and regular. And this distinction is made because in complex applications, there generally are redundant components, right, or clusters of components. For example, take a database cluster, right? If one of the database nodes blows up, this isn't necessarily the end of the world. The other nodes keep doing the work. Now, you definitely want your ops team to know that something has gone wrong, but the actual service is running, because the other nodes in the cluster are providing the service. So a regular monitor would be testing, the various database instances in the cluster to see if they're working. And if anything fails, an ops team or your operations team is going to get notifications in real time about what's actually gone wrong and what application it's part of. The master monitor would be executing, for example, a transaction of some kind in the database or triggering something through a web portal. If that transaction doesn't work or takes too long to run, then you're really at risk of violating your SLO because you can no longer meet the response time or availability required. So the master services are the more end-user oriented tests, right? And the regular services are simply your regular infrastructure tests, which indicate that perhaps something is going wrong in your environment. This view here is simply slightly more detail into what we have one of the email tests, or one of the email application monitors. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Essentially, it just shows what various components are. And you can actually have nested tests. So an application can be made of many different other application components, and you get this complex roll-up of capabilities and tests, so you can really understand what's going on in your environment. One final screenshot here, outlines SLA trending. And earlier in the presentation, I mentioned backtesting, and what I have here is an SLA report that shows how the SLA has been doing on a week-over-week basis. Right? And again, this is just one individual SLA, and this gives us insight into how we've been historically performing. And as you can see, we're kind of trending down, which isn't so good. So with the unified monitoring solution, which is already gathering your availability and performance info, it's possible to create SLAs with different targets and do some historical analysis to see how your services have been doing. So, if you go and say, I want to be 90% available, and find out that you've already ever been 60% available for the past 4 months, well, then you have some work to do before you actually sign up for that kind of commitment. And really what we want to do is just help you gain some understanding of your environment before you potentially overcommit to high availability right out of the gate. So in summary here, what we talked about was just how do we talk the same language, right? So when people talk BSM and service-oriented architectures and high-level application monitoring, what does that actually mean? And how when a business user says, an application must be available and running, that potentially can mean something very different from what an IT person who has a very infrastructure-focused point of view, what they would be talking about. And we covered off some routines around SLAs, and then essentially just stepped through some sample examples of what an SLA looked like. Obviously, there are many other components, but that kind of gives you a high-level view. So thanks very much for sitting through this. We have some Q&A now, and certainly if you want to experience what I've shown you, you're more than welcome to check out our website and resource portal, and obviously try out a trial as well. I guess, Paul, do you want to take over?
Sure. We got a question here about ITSM. Is there a solution that can solve the entire BSM to SLA to ITSM problem?
Finding one tool to do that is it is possible, but it's a very complex problem to solve, and there are many different moving components. And again, where your challenge lies is it's almost less to do with the tooling, but more to do with how well do you really understand your environment, and knowing that it is always changing and there are always very complex components. So part of managing your environment is really understanding what's going on, or at least really being able to identify supercritical revenue generating applications, right? Because when you're dealing with hundreds of apps in your environment, you really want to tier out the key ones and have those monitored by a comprehensive tool set.
I think you mentioned at the outset one customer who thought he had about 25 cloud apps and actually had about 200. Is that a common problem that you encounter with customers when they start talking to you about your solution?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the cloud apps now are generally very pervasive, certainly on desktops. But as a lot of application developers within within businesses, they will depend upon cloud-based services or APIs to extract data for their applications. And you can't always bring those in-house, or sometimes nor would you want to bring them in-house, right? So there is an ever-increasing dependence on information that is outside of the organization. And certainly, if you are going to create an SLA to your own internal business users or to your customers, it might be easier to do with infrastructure you control. But if a third-party external service is down and they don't provide you with an SLA, you're a little bit hamstrung. And really, it's like what I talked about earlier. You need to do a risk assessment, right, in terms of, well, where is my exposure, right, and what can I control or what can I not control.
Well, a listener asked, where can I find sample SLAs for ISP, VoIP, and cable services? You didn't cover those in your presentation, but are those really applicable? Really those
sample SLAs, I don't really have examples of that per se. Really, what's involved there is simply understanding, okay, if you're an ISP, or if you're using your ISP, it's where are the touch points, right? And do you have redundant links? Or if you're using a VoIP service, is where are your key critical points of failure? To identify those. I can't think of a template off the top of my head though.
Right. One listener asked, how long does it take to set up an SLA?
Well, again, ultimately it depends on how complicated it is, right? And if there's 50 pieces of infrastructure and 5 apps, then I found that it can take 2 weeks just to actually find the documentation to build up how that works. If you know what your objectives are, you know what your key business metrics are, and you know what all the infrastructure is, you can set up an SLA with 20 mouse clicks and be ready to go. So, that actually can be very quick, and ultimately, the building it into the tool is not the difficult part. It's understanding what it is that you really want to monitor, or how you want to report on your SLA.
We do have a question here that's specific to uptime, specific to a support issue with uptime. We will get to you offline about that one, but it's not really appropriate for this forum. Another question from a listener is, can you set up SLAs without a service catalog?
Well, absolutely, and certainly, having a service catalog is really I would call it a step up the maturity cycle. Right, so lots of people who are evolving or growing their businesses or have smaller infrastructures, don't have a service catalog. Right, it's not worth them to go through that kind of or adopt that kind of technology. Their service catalog will be written down or it'll be sitting in someone's head. So it's how do you actually then build your SLA, out of that minimal documentation. Obviously, the more sophisticated you get, the larger your infrastructure, the more complex your applications, the more dynamic your virtualization. Service catalog becomes a very key component of that. And then obviously, the challenges with service catalogs nowadays are how do they actually deal with hyperdynamic environments, right? Again, so as we inject new and cool technology into our environments, it just becomes harder and harder for the tooling and the processes to keep up.
Alex, you've been talking about the need for a partnership with the business units to really manage SLAs effectively. Questioner asks, as an IT manager, how do I start my credible conversation with those business units?
Really, it's a matter of identifying, well, what are, on a per business unit basis, well, what is the application that makes the business unit money or is a prime driver for a service that they offer, right? And so, as the provider of that application to the business, it's sitting down and saying, okay, well, what is actually critical for you? I'm monitoring all sorts of important things within the infrastructure. I know if I give you a report on, well, here's been the availability of my routers and systems and switches over the past week, a business guy is going to go, well, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? So, but if you say, look, we were able to provide a sub-second response time to all of your customers between these business hours when we know that they use the applications, that's great because it means people have been able to do what they've wanted to do. So again, it's just asking that. Well, what is important to you? Help me understand how your application works and how you make money from it.
We have a question about Uptime's other businesses. It says, does Uptime only do SLAs, or do you also do other monitoring and reporting as well?
Oh, Uptime is a very comprehensive solution for lots of heterogeneous platform monitoring. We do very comprehensive reporting on availability and performance, capacity planning, SLAs. So, no, it is we cross all kinds of virtualization technologies, cloud technologies. So I can rant for another half an hour on this, but essentially I would definitely check the resource tab and check the website out for more details there.
Right, and just that's one more reminder to check your resource tab, which has some useful additional resources for you, including a 30-day free trial of the Uptime service. And with that, we are going to finish up this presentation. I'd like to thank Alex for joining us today. Be sure to check out the archived version of the webcast, which will provide a PDF download of all the slides we've covered today. Watch your inbox for notification of when that archive is available, and it will be shortly. And be sure to share that archive with others in your organization who might be interested. If you'd like to contact Alex, you can please use the email address that's on your screen right now. A survey should be popping up on your screen right now, or it will do so momentarily. When it does, please fill it out to help us improve these webcasts in the future. We hope to see all of you at future Gwynn Street webcasts. For now, this is Paul Gillen signing off on behalf of today's sponsor, Uptime Software. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.